We're going to go ahead and bring in right now Dr. Will Freeman, a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Freeman, thank you for your time this morning. We appreciate it. If you can give us your thoughts as we watch this whole situation unravel here.
Well, I think you were right to mention that this is fairly unprecedented. Of course, we've seen cartels in Mexico flex their muscle before, try to send messages to the state that their top leaders cannot or should not be captured. But yesterday we saw attacks across 20 states, roadblocks, cars set on fire, and as you mentioned, over 25 military personnel killed. So it's a major escalation. At the same time, it seems to have been calibrated. We haven't seen major attacks in Mexico City, which is typically treated as a kind of no-go zone for this sort of terrorist violence by the cartels. They don't usually venture there because I think they're afraid of inviting an even bigger retaliation from the state. So I think the big question is, in the days ahead, do we see a new sort of status quo solidify? Do we see the state and cartel both back off from each other, or do we see this continue to ramp up? Another variable being who takes over for El Mencho, the eliminated kingpin here. There are 4 or 5 lieutenants in the Jalisco New Generation Cartel who many think will be vying for that position. If there's a succession process already set up, maybe it's relatively smooth. If there's not, maybe we see cartel civil wars start to erupt in some number of those 20 states.
Okay, let me go back and ask you then, do we know how long they have been tracking the head of the cartel? Is it surprising that they were able to get to him the way that they did? And then when you're talking about the bloodshed and the war within the cartel, how will that affect residents and everyday people?
So there were rumors of the military closing in on El Mencho even last week, but I think the exact timing was surprising. And you, in fact, see the reaction of Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum when she herself was called on to give a public address about this. She seemed surprised, I think, by the exact moment and speed with which it had happened. In terms of the public reaction in Mexico, obviously there's a lot of fear. I think people are waiting to see on that same question. I mean, does this devolve into criminal infighting and a new round of criminal civil war, or do we see things stabilize relatively quickly? And we have to remember there's another variable here, which is the Trump administration, which has been calling for Mexico to take a much more aggressive approach. The governing party in Mexico has, for the past 7 years, most of that time pursued a policy that they called hugs, not bullets. The idea was to lean back from confrontation with the cartels because attacking them in the past had only escalated violence. It had only led to more killing without really eliminating them. However, you've seen since Trump came into office, especially that same party in Mexico led by Sheinbaum pivoting towards a more and more confrontational approach. And I think this is, without a doubt, the biggest act of confrontation we've seen towards the cartels, not only in this government, but in the last 20 years in Mexico.
I think this was interesting to kind of watch it unravel. For years, there have, we've been talking about cartels and, infiltrating the United States in different ways. And they're nothing new to Mexico, in fact. But it seems as though in the past they've always stayed away from touristy spots. It seems as though that was kind of the motto. This completely shifts from that whole thought process that we had before.
I think that they're extremely present in tourist hotspots, but they're invisible there. In fact, they're often the ones running the tourist businesses. You just saw last week that the State Department under Marco Rubio sanctioned a luxury resort chain in the nearby state on the Pacific coast of Nayarit, in the Riviera Nayarit, because it was operated by the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. When you're talking about these beach resorts in Mexico, many times small farmers, individual people have been driven off that land through torture, through disappearance, and then it's turned over to businesses which have ties to the cartels. So I'm not saying every American tourist who goes there is indirectly paying the cartels, but are they present in those areas? Absolutely.
Interesting.
Therefore, all they had to do was flip a switch, and they could turn on violence in places exactly like Puerto Vallarta.
So USA Today reporting 42 minutes ago, flights are expected to resume to Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta's airports, and that the president is now saying that things have started to, quote, calm down. Are you hearing anything about that? We have many Americans, especially from the Arizona area, who are stranded there and do not know when they'll be able to return.
Yeah, this could be. I think it's really hard to say right now because again, we may have seen the biggest burst of this already. Obviously, things are less confrontational today than yesterday, but it could also be just the first chapter in a succession battle for who controls the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, currently Mexico's biggest criminal organization. So I'd say even if people are able to get out now, the next few months in Mexico are going to look potentially very unstable.
What is this like for people who live in Mexico? We have a lot of Americans who choose, maybe to live there most of the year, come back to the United States part of the year. For some people who live in some of those Mexican cities or towns, are they used to seeing, you mentioned the cartel owning businesses and even touristy spots, are they used to seeing cartel around? And what do you suppose it's like for them now to see this sort of retaliation in their towns and cities?
I think it completely depends. There are areas where cartel power is very present but quite invisible, especially if you don't choose to ask about it or don't know to ask the right questions. There are other areas where it's a palpable, obvious, everyday reality. Often in places where different cartels or different factions of them are fighting each other, that's where you just can't escape seeing this every single day. I think in terms of how ordinary Mexicans are also feeling, we can't discount the significant number who are deeply frustrated, both at their own politicians for having accommodated these cartels for so long, but also at the United States for being the world's largest drug market. The reason that these cartels are so wealthy, the reason that they're able to recruit so massively in Mexico, that they have the money to do that, and also at the United States for being the country that supplies the vast majority of the weapons floating around Mexico, fueling this conflict. And something like 7 or 8 out of every 10 guns recovered at a crime scene in Mexico is U.S. made. Wow. So a huge flow of illegally trafficked firearms. And I hate to say it, but the border between Arizona and Mexico is actually, according to many studies, both top in terms of cocaine trafficking, Phoenix being one of the major cocaine consumption hubs in the entire country.
So, hey, Will,
top for that illegal arms trafficking.
One quick moment. We're going to take a quick break. Will, can you hang with us for a couple of minutes? We just have a couple more questions for you, sister. Let's go back out to Will Freeman. Will, thank you for hanging out with us, my friend. We appreciate you. And Anita, you had a question about travel.
Well, Celeste mentioned it off the top, and we've been talking about how many Americans, especially from the Arizona area, head to Mexico. We have friends who we know have mentioned they have birthday party celebrations coming up in 3 weeks. Our director mentioned that a sister-in-law is getting married in June. What are we looking for as far as those travel plans? When do you start putting them on hold?
I think you should watch what happens in the next week or two in terms of potential renewed flare-ups of violence, especially in western Mexico, where the Jalisco New Generation Cartel is strongest. If we see those, I think it does suggest that there's this succession war underway. And when those play out, we've seen them before. We're seeing one right now in Sinaloa, in the heart of the Sinaloa cartel. They can be long, they can be open-ended, and can lead to a lot of unpredictability. But I think it's a sobering reminder. Mexico's a great country. I travel there. I encourage other people to travel there and get to know it, but you shouldn't go there and forget that it's a country in the middle of effectively a civil war. Whether or not you're seeing that in the places you're visiting, whether or not you're asking people about it and really coming to understand it, there is a massive amount of killing and disappearance going on in the country at all times. And I think it's just something to be conscious of, as well as the fact that not much of it would be happening without the role the U.S. plays in consuming the drugs and supplying the weapons. So unfortunately, it's not escapable. And anyone traveling to Mexico, no matter where they're going, you scratch beneath the surface and it's there.
Can you give us a little perspective as we wrap up? I think a lot of us remember El Chapo. Now we have El Mencho there with this other cartel. Right. How many different cartels are there in Mexico? And I'm guessing, obviously, this one was very powerful. Give us an idea, if you can, of kind of like that life. What is it like there in Mexico with these cartels? Mm-hmm.
So there are two major ones, Sinaloa and Jalisco, but their futures are very uncertain. Sinaloa, as I mentioned, is in the middle of an internal civil war. Not clear that it'll come back together as one organization. And we don't know yet what will happen to Jalisco, but both those organizations have presence in dozens of Mexican states and dozens of foreign countries, as well as, of course, the United States. Below that, you have, over 20 regional mafias, which have significant state and local presence, which are often very predatory to local populations. And then even below below that, you have a kind of a substratum of local gangs. So it's quite a complex picture. And I think the big question for Mexico is, by confronting these groups militarily, that's necessary. I mean, no doubt about that. You need to send a message that their activities are not tolerable. But what else is going to form part of this strategy? Will Mexico now build an effective judiciary, which is necessary to investigate and prosecute the money launderers and political enablers? Will we see the United States provide support for that strategy? So I think that those are all questions that have yet to be resolved.
The points you made earlier about the border and the drugs coming into the U.S., but also the U.S. supplying the guns, is really on point and goes to show that, like you were saying, perhaps the people in Mexico are tired of that, and that is a step in the direction that needs to be taken.
That's right. And I think you've seen, the Trump administration and previous ones partially take steps on this. You've seen actually the Trump administration DOJ prosecute, for instance, 2 Utah business people who, lo and behold, were part of a fuel trafficking ring that was majorly enriching Mexican cartels. You've seen them take some steps on the gun question, but these have really not been questions that our political system has stepped up to address under either party. And I think that if we hope for a long-term stabilization in Mexico, which we should, so that we can, do more business with our top trade partners, so more people can visit and sponsor the tour, be part of the tourism economy and experience. For all those reasons, and so we can have a more stable border, we're eventually going to have to come to a point where the United States decides, is it willing to really work on those issues of drug demand and illegal firearm trafficking, or does it essentially allow the status quo to fester? In which case, maybe Mencho's gone, but we'll see a new cartel emerge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, isn't that the case? Dr. Will Freeman, a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in the rule of law. Will, it's good to see you. Thank you so much for your time. We look forward to keeping you on our favorites list so we can call on you in the future, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you.